I wanted to ask you about a piece you wrote last year in the New York Review of Books called Russia, the Conspiracy Trap, in which you wrote, Russiagate is helping Trump by distracting from real, documentable and documented issues and by promoting a xenophobic conspiracy theory in the cause of removing a xenophobic conspiracy theorist from office.
I couldn't have said it better myself. But yeah, I mean, look, he is doing unspeakable damage to our political culture, to American institutions, to politics as we have known it, which hasn't been perfect, but it's certainly, it's being badly damaged. And I think I'm really worried that it's being damaged in ways that will make it extremely difficult to recover. And we don't have endless bandwidth. We don't have endless column inches available, even on the internet, right? And every time that we talk about Russiagate, we are not talking about immigration, right? Every time we talk about Russiagate, we're not talking about the decimation of the State Department. And every time we talk about Russiagate, we're not talking about deregulation.
And of course, Russia's not the only one doing it. And interestingly, the piece Saturday, right after the indictments came down on Friday, the New York Times, in the jump to the inside page, has a little phrase that says, of course, it's not that the CIA hasn't done this kind of thing before.
I mean, that's an interesting conversation, right? I mean, I think that there are perfectly valid arguments to be made when we say, okay, it's not the same, right? Some foreign interference may be acceptable or justifiable, and some may not be. If it's us doing it, it's one thing. If it's them doing it, it's another thing.
I mean, you look at.
But let's engage with those arguments, right? Let's not act like any foreign country. Trying to influence the outcome of the American election is a priori wrong, and this is not a popular argument, but I think it's an important one. This president is putting every person in the world at risk of dying in a nuclear holocaust. This president is putting every person in the world at risk of living on a planet where irreversible damage has been done to the climate. Right? And so to say that the world has no business has no stake in the outcome of the American election is actually irresponsible and wrong and also xenophobic, right? I mean, it's very Trumpian to sort of say, we'll do whatever we want here because we've got our sovereignty. Think about that, right? And then make a reasoned argument for keeping Russians, out of the American public sphere because they are so disruptive, misleading, bad faith, et cetera. But it has to be a good reasoned argument and not just this knee-jerk xenophobia.
And Trump saying, talking about these indictments, that they're sowing, creating, if it was the goal of Russia to create discord, disruption, chaos within the U.S., then with all the committee hearings, investigations, and party hatred, they've succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. They're laughing their asses off in Moscow. After a little bit over a year of Trump, there's a tweet that I actually agree with. I don't know what to do with myself now. So you have this serving all sorts of purposes. When you heard this was, well, the latest in the Russian indictments, which Rod Rosenstein was very clear in saying this does not implicate the, Trump campaign. Right. We're just saying that they're doing this. And what does it mean to say that these people and these companies have been indicted? I mean, they don't live here. They're in Russia. They're not going to be extradited here.
Right. I mean, we can conjecture that perhaps one or more of them will be offered an opportunity to come here and testify in exchange for something, and maybe that's why this indictment is useful. But I have no idea. I think it's really important in dealing with this stuff to actually deal with what's out there, like the information that's available. The information that's available is pretty scant, pretty unconvincing, and does not yet justify the amount of attention that we're paying to it and the importance that we're assigning to it.
Now, of course, one of the things that Trump is doing is saying, OK, if this happened, and he's saying this under enormous pressure, you should be investigating President Obama. He tweeted, question, if all of the Russian meddling took place during the Obama administration right up to January 20th, why aren't they the subject of the investigation? Why didn't Obama do something about the meddling? Why aren't Dem crimes under investigation? Ask Jeff Sessions. the president tweeted.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of reaches the limit of being able to engage with the Trumpian tweet. I mean, I think it's a reasonable question, why the Obama administration didn't do anything about the interference. We know a little bit about it. I mean, there's actually been pretty decent reporting on it. We know that the Obama administration believed that Hillary was going to win and didn't want to put its finger on the scale, and by taking measures against Russians, I think it's entirely possible that they were looking at the material and thinking, it's pretty ridiculous material. We may be seeing as overreacting, and since she's going to win anyway, why bother? That's a good journalistic story. I mean, I don't think there's anything there to investigate.
And this latest news of the Trump administration actually applying the sanctions that Congress called for under enormous pressure this week. What kind of effect would that have on Russia? What kind of effect does it have on Putin? They're just considering this.
Right. So a couple of things. First of all, I mean, there's the issue of sanctions being required by law, and the Trump administration missing its deadline for imposing those sanctions. And that's a problem, right? I mean, that's a problem regardless of the substance of these sanctions and how useful they might be, and whether we think they're justified, right? I think that's the problem, not so much of Trump. We should be focused less on the problem of Trump not imposing sanctions in Russia and more on the problem of having a president who can just dismiss a law passed by Congress, just ignore it. I mean, that in the long run is much more damaging to our political system than whether it's Russia or not.
Would you call it very Putin-esque?
I would call it very Putin-esque. I mean, it's. I would call,
would Putin do that?
Putin would absolutely do that. Yeah, but I mean, it's not like Putin has an independent legislator to deal with. But certainly, yeah, Putin will ignore laws or reinterpret them or redraft them as suits his purposes. But I mean, that's the sort of the autocratic mentality. Well, why? I'm president. Why should I do something that I don't want to do? And I think that's very much sort of. That's Trump, that's Putin, and that's every other autocrat on the planet, and there are lots of them now. A second issue is, are these sanctions at all useful, and should they be imposed? And my position is actually that we need to stop thinking of sanctions as instruments for changing Putin's behavior, because they don't work like that. They've never worked like that. They will not work like that. The only thing that they can do is annoy him, and that when he's extremely annoyed, then they're well-designed sanctions. I think the Magnitsky List sanctions are extremely well-designed, and I can explain why. But they're not going to get him to change his behavior, right?
Explain.
And
how.
Yet, well,
what you mean by well-designed?
So the Magnitsky List sanctions, which are personal sanctions against people whom the U.S. government believes to be implicated in grave violations of human rights, but they focus on people who are fairly close to Putin, who are wealthy, and they essentially lose their ability to not just to own assets and to travel here, but to do any business with U.S. currency. Right. So it's a serious blow to their businesses. The reason they're well designed is not because it's such a serious blow to their businesses, although it is, but because Putin positions himself as the patriarch who distributes money and power within the clan. And those sanctions actually directly attack his ability to distribute money and power, because the U.S. government basically takes away the money and the power that he is gifted. And I think there's brilliance to those sanctions, and that's exactly why those sanctions are the ones that get the biggest reaction out of Putin. Now, the conceit behind these sanctions, there are a couple of theories behind them. One is that we will get the elite so mad that they will coalesce against Putin. That's not going to happen. Another is that it will hurt the Russian economy, and Putin will get worried about becoming less popular, and that's also not going to happen. The kind of regime that Putin has built actually thrives on economic scarcity. he's not going to be hurt by sanctions. And in fact, the counter-sanctions that he has imposed in response to the sanctions imposed because of the war in Ukraine, the counter-sanctions have had a bigger impact on the Russian economy than the sanctions themselves. Still, I think sanctions are the right thing to do. And they're the right thing to do not because they can affect Putin's behavior, but because it's wrong to do business with a dictator. It's wrong to be partners with a country that claims to be fighting terrorism when actually it's waging war against several nations within its own empire in the guise of fighting terrorism. And what I found even more disturbing than Trump's failure to impose sanctions was that very week when he was supposed to impose sanctions, 3 Russian spy chiefs who are under U.S. sanctions came into the country to discuss cooperation on fighting terrorism.
Here. Came to
the United States.
At the invitation of the Trump administration.
At the invitation of the Trump administration, which basically overrode the sanctions in order to bring them to the country. And they clearly think that it's politically safe to do that because it's fighting terrorism. But actually what it is, it's being in bed with a bloody dictator, who imprisons and kills his opponents, and who, in the guise of fighting terrorism, has killed hundreds of thousands of people.
Another plea agreement was announced, this one with a 33-year-old attorney, Alex van der Zwaan, who pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI about his contacts with Trump campaign official Rick Gates. Apparently, he deleted email with him. Van der Zwaan, son-in-law of German Khan, a Ukrainian-Russian billionaire, one of the richest men in Russia, and the owner of Alpha Group. Can you tell us about who he is and the significance of this, if there is significance?
It's hard to tell, right? Alpha Group, the name of Alpha Group has surfaced repeatedly in conversations about the potential ties between Russia and Trump. There was that story about a server in the Trump Tower that seemed to be exist exclusively to facilitate connections to Alpha Bank. At the time, the FBI told the New York Times, this is now over a year ago, that they didn't see anything conspicuous about that server, that maybe it was just a disused server that Alpha Bank was, that accidentally became the target of Alpha Bank spam. My guess is that that's not really the case, that there was something going on. But, we just don't have enough information at this point to say, okay, Alpha Group, this Dutch guy who's been indicted, Khan's son-in-law, we can piece it all together now. We can't piece it all together yet. And it's still an open question whether Mueller can piece it all together.
And the media's obsession with Russiagate. If you turned on CNN, if you turned on MSNBC, I was talking to a Russian cab driver the other day, and he said, I left Russia to escape Putin, and all I see is Putin in the United States.
Well, you know what? On the one hand, all you see is Putin in the United States. On the other hand, my friends who are foreign correspondents in Moscow are just desperate because they haven't had an opportunity to write about Russia for over a year now, because all their editors are interested in is what Russia did to the American election. And actually, that's a really great example of how incredibly sort of circular in our thinking we have become, and how even more self-obsessed than before the Trump election.
And the effects overall on the critical issues that are facing people in this country. I wanted to, as we begin to wrap up, ask you about the news agencies that are now registering as foreign agents in the United States. Most recently, RIA Global, which produces content for the Russian state-owned news outlet Sputnik, registered as a foreign agent last week, and I believe in November, RT also did.
Yeah, so they've been required by the federal government to register as foreign agents. Legally, there seems to be a very solid case for. They certainly are foreign agents. They're agents of a foreign state, especially RT, which broadcasts here. It's a reasonable question to ask about the relevance and consequences of the requirement to register as foreign agents. Because, first of all, Russians are going to react. They have reacted by putting more pressure on foreign journalists there. I bet they're going to start requiring regular, independently owned American media to start registering as foreign agents, which will make it much more difficult for these media to function. Not that they're having a great time working in Moscow in the first place. It also seems to just fuel this sort of xenophobic attitude without having any real consequences. I mean, what is the benefit of having these companies registered as foreign agents? But I wouldn't waste a lot of breath debating this.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to end at a point you made at the very beginning, with the networks obsessed with the Russia connection. Mm-hmm. And what it means about what it leads to, which is this lack of self-reflection when it comes to President Trump being elected President of the United States.
Right. So ultimately, we keep talking about how Russians elected Trump. And even if everything that, the wildest hopes of people who are watching the Russia investigation with bated breath, even if their wildest hopes come true, and it can be shown that Russia influenced the outcome of the election, Russia will have influenced the outcome of the election by influencing American public opinion, which brings us to square one, which is to ask why and how did so many Americans decide that they wanted Donald Trump for president. And that's the conversation we should have been having for the last year and a half instead of obsessing about Russia.
And you think it serves the Democratic Party, or at least those entrenched in power now, to continually say, look outside, it couldn't have been us?
I don't actually I don't think it serves the Democratic Party. I think that because it's, I don't think that the problem is that the Democratic Party gets to cover up its failures. I think the problem is that the Democratic Party is not pushed to try to figure out what it needs to be doing now. It's not pushed to confront the very basic fact that there were a lot of people in this country who went to the polls consciously to cast a protest vote. Not because they thought that Donald Trump is going to make life better for them and is going to bring back manufacturing, but because the system hasn't worked for them for so long, because they conscientiously went and voted, and they were told that their life was going to get better, and their life gets worse, and they don't see a cause and effect relationship between the votes that they cast for politicians who promise them things and their lives. And they finally say, if Donald Trump is the grenade that I can throw at the system, then I'll do that.
Russian-American journalist Masha Gessen. Her most recent piece for The New Yorker magazine is headlined "The Fundamental Uncertainty of Mueller's Russia Indictments." When we come back, world-renowned filmmaker Raoul Peck. He'll respond to Wayne LaPierre attacking gun control advocates as communists. His new film, Raoul Peck's, is called The Young Karl Marx. Stay with us.